Thank you. Thank all of you, and thank you, Vic, for that warm introduction. Bill Clinton always used to say, if you're going to be introduced, you ought to be introduced by an old friend or someone looking for a job. And Vic and Marion Barry are two of my best friends were two of my best friends in the House, and I've visited both of them on this occasion. And they were special partly because, not just because we sat side by side in Vic's case on the House Armed Services Committee, because we did things together. And we did things together that, in retrospect, I'm very proud of. Vic and I worked hard to delay the invasion of Iraq, to delay by putting up a resolution with John Spratt of South Carolina. We tried to slow down the rush to war. Now, we didn't succeed, but we sure tried hard. And Marion Barry and I were co-chairs of a House caucus on prescription drugs for seniors, and we worked very hard on those issues. And I just have to say, being able to come here to the Clinton School and to see both of them is really an honor and a privilege. I'm delighted to be with you all. I did get to know President Clinton before he was President Clinton. I don't have stories, except that within 3 weeks of his arrival, I went over in the fall of '67, he came over in the fall of 1968, and with 3 weeks of his arrival, my wife and I were down in front of the U.S. Embassy, walking back and forth in what must have been one of the most measured, sedate demonstrations to occur in London in 1968. And Bill Clinton, although he only arrived 3 weeks before, was one of the main speakers holding forth on why the invasion, why what was going on in Vietnam was a mistake. So he's been a friend for a very long time. I helped organize and run the Clinton campaign in the state of Maine, and I thank Arkansas for sending him to become your governor, and then, of course, to be president, because I think in retrospect those were difficult years, but they were much better in a lot of ways than what we are going through right now. So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about this book. And you know, when I first wrote it, it took over 3.5 years. I mean, John Stewart, I was once at an event with John Stewart, and he said, the best way to write a book is to have staff. Well, that's great if you have staff, but if you don't, you peck away on weekends and at nights trying to pull this thing together. And so it took a while to do, but I was always worried that it would be outdated by the time it was published. Well, actually not, as it turns out. I too sort of cherish, I guess, in a weird way, the chance to be speaking on the eve of the government shutdown, which I think is almost certain to come at midnight tonight. And so this book is an explanation of how we got here, not just how we got to January when it was published, but how we got here today, to try to explain what I think has been going on, particularly with the Republican Party, but also with the Democratic Party, and how we've reached this place. One of my reviewers said that I have a different take on political polarization, and that's right. So I'm going to start by telling you what I don't think are the biggest reasons for political polarization and congressional gridlock. I grant they have an effect. Number one, members don't live in Congress and socialize on weekends. Well, it's true. Maybe some effect. Congressional redistricting shapes uncompetitive districts and allows Democrats and Republicans on the fringe to get elected to the House. True, but we have a governor in Maine right now who was elected statewide, who is a Tea Party governor, and gubernatorial and Senate races sure look a lot like congressional races, although I grant you the House is worse than it would be if we did a better job having judicial oversight of redistricting, which some states, including mine, does. 3, party primaries are not open to enough people in the middle, and therefore they tend to elect more extreme Republicans or Democrats. True, but again, from my point of view, not the biggest of reasons. There's a 24/7 news hour by the cable companies featuring people way on the left and way on the right because that's what drives ratings. Yeah, I think so, sort of. Republicans and Democrats are both captive to big money. That's true. But the question about money is, why do people believe what they are being sold? Why do they believe what they are being sold? And also, and this is true, House and Senate rules have been manipulated mostly by the majority in the House and mostly by the minority in the Senate, although by the majority in the Senate too, to block the other side from accomplishing anything. Now neither side trusts the other. That's true. And here's the final one before I get to what I want to say. The American people consistently elect a bunch of selfish jerks who go to Washington and immediately forget what people wanted them to do while they were there. Well, some evidence for that, but I'm not going to say that much. So what I've done here is tried to take what I heard people saying on both sides of the aisle, particularly our adversaries as Democrats, and try to understand what's going on, why they are thinking that way. One of the things we would say to ourselves, do these guys believe what they say? Tax cuts pay for themselves? We'll be welcomed as liberators? Climate science isn't proven? The reaction, I think, of most Democrats when I was there, they can't believe that. They are wrong, they're lying. Of course, Republicans looking at Democrats would say, they're pandering. They're pandering. When they talk about tax cuts for the rich, they're just pandering to people. They don't really believe that. And it was that kind of disbelief of what the other side was saying that I think drives a lot of the polarization. What I am arguing fundamentally is when you dig down below the surface of the arguments, ideas matter. And big ideas, bundled into what I called worldviews, matter most. And there are now, I would say, we are divided less by region, less by even income, and less by a bunch of other demographic features, but we are divided primarily by worldview. One worldview emphasizes America's quintessential virtue, self-reliance, individualism. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Stand on your own 2 feet. Don't depend on someone else. And there's another worldview that is competing. Both of these are wound deeply into American culture. The other worldview is we're better together. Everyone needs help along the way. And if we work together in pursuit of a common purpose, we'll all be better off. Now that second word, the first one, I mean, I don't even have to talk about that in many ways. A book was done a number of years ago, and the conclusion was, in America, as a result of a lot of interviews, Americans have 2 languages. The first language by which we explain our success, and actually others' failure, is about working hard, taking on a challenge, and doing it yourself. It's a very easy way to explain what happens in the world. Other people are failing because, frankly, they haven't worked hard enough, they haven't dug themselves out of a bad situation, whatever. But the second way, and this comes out of our communities of faith, and it really comes out of the Founding Fathers, it's an ethic of being in a common enterprise together and making it work. James Madison said, the public good, the real welfare of the community, whole community of people, is what we are striving for in setting up these government institutions. That's what it's all about. It's about the public good, the common good, however you want to say that. Now, so I'm going to, when I chose the topics that I would write about, I avoided immigration, I avoided abortion, I avoided gay rights, gay marriage, all of that stuff which is so deeply grounded in religious faith of one kind or another, or emotion, that I wanted to set that aside and try to find out why we're so divided on things we used to be able to negotiate. And so there are 4 substantive chapters in the book, one dealing with the budget and taxes, one with Iraq, one with health care, I'll come back to that, and one with climate change. And so the first thing I want to say about these, I can say more concisely by reading. These 4 topics, budget and taxes, Iraq, healthcare, climate change involve different issues, evidence, and approaches. Yet in Congress, they seem to be part of a whole, as if something not immediately apparent tied them all together. Otherwise, the parties would not have been so fiercely divided on such disparate matters. Interest group politics can explain some of the differences. Each party appeals to and is supported by different combinations of business, labor, and other organized activists. But interest group politics is now often overwhelmed by worldview politics, a widening, hardening conflict between those who believe that the mission of government is to advance the common good and those who believe government is an obstacle to that end. If this is true, at one level, all domestic issues merge into one, an unproductive, irreconcilable, ideological conflict about government itself. Ultimately, however, this conflict is less about the role of government than the enduring tension between individualism and community in American politics and culture, and therefore as much about the electorate as our leaders. What I'm trying to explain or talk about is that we look at the world through different lenses. Have any of you done Myers-Briggs psychological testing? Well, I have, not for a while, but that was, for me, a wonderful experience because if you haven't done it, you take this test and you get categorized into one of 4 different psychological types, which vary somewhat among each other. But what you take away from it is that other people turn out to be wired differently than I am. But you know, they're okay. They think differently, they react differently. For me, in my work today, running an association with 32 people, I look for those people for whom being criticized is a very sensitive undertaking. And I recognize they have to be criticized or critiqued very carefully because when you criticize their work, you're criticizing them. In the same way, we look at politics differently, very quickly. A long time ago, a political scientist named Isaiah Berlin wrote a little essay called The Hedgehog and the Fox, and it was about Tolstoy's view of history. And he said, it comes from a Greek fragment of a poem, which it runs, "The fox knows many things, the hedgehog knows one big thing." And he used that as a way to distinguish between 2 groups of people. One group, the hedgehogs, really need to have an organizing principle by which they make sense of the world, a single central vision, as Berlin called it. Other people, they don't need that. They kind of appreciate, accept, or even revel in the confusion and the diversity and the contradiction of human beings, and they've got a lot of material to work with. There's a second sort of set of lenses you're familiar with. Some people look at the world in black and white, some see shades of gray. And my point here is we're wired that way. It's not that we can't adjust, but we're basically wired that way. And we shouldn't be too hard on someone who's wired differently. If we understand them, maybe we can do better at connecting. In this book, as I've said, I think people are wired sometimes to be more individualists and sometimes to be more community-driven. Both of those are part of American culture. Both of them are wired into us, but I guess I would say in different proportions. The political consequence of this is that Republicans, and here's where we get into trouble. If you believe in self-reliance and individualism, and you convert that personal belief into an attitude toward government, you can wind up where the libertarian Republicans are today, which is you believe that government by its very nature infringes on personal liberty. By its very nature, it creates dependency among the population, and third, it screws up everything it does. And so that's certainly not an un-American view. It's part of who we are. But if you get to believe that, and you get to believe smaller government, lower taxes is the defining principle that you hold, then sit back and try to figure out, based on those principles, what you're going to do about improving education, how you're going to expand health care coverage, and what you're going to do about climate change. My point is, it's not just that certain people on the right don't want to do those things. They think that doing those things is dangerous because that kind of government action in any of those areas will increase dependency and diminish human freedom. And yet, it's a powerful political message. It's the best political message. Smaller government, lower taxes. Who can't be for that? Well, a lot of people can't be for that because of its implications. But the polarization, the inability to talk across the aisle has a lot to do with those two competing worldviews. Because Democrats still believe that government is a way to create opportunity, think student loans, the way to create opportunity for people who don't have it, and also to handle these common problems we can't otherwise do. I'll skim through a bunch of things here. I don't want to talk too long, but I do go on. I was a member of Congress after all. The title, Dangerous Convictions, it comes from a quotation from Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, "Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies." Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies. Now, what do we want from our elected representatives? We want convictions. But convictions that aren't grounded in evidence and aren't grounded in expertise are a real problem. And if you ask me, that's where I think we kind of go astray with the other side. Tax cuts pay for themselves. We heard it routinely. They weren't worried about the 2001 tax cut. They weren't worried about the 2003 tax cut, enormous tax cuts, because the tax cuts will pay for themselves. Or alternatively, it's not the government's money, it's your money. Yet those two decisions, when you step back and look in hindsight, those two decisions and a couple other tax cuts the Bush administration did drained the federal treasury over 10 years of something around $2.9 trillion. Now, $2.9 trillion is real money over 10 years. It's an enormous amount of money. But in 2010, Mitch McConnell, he's the gift that keeps on giving. If you look up Mitch McConnell in the back of this book in the index, you'll see he is the gift that keeps on giving. In 2010, he told the press that he disagreed that the Bush tax cuts had diminished federal revenue because in his view, they stimulated the economy so much that they increased revenues. Now let's assume that he meant at least by $5, okay? So let's say he was claiming the tax cuts increased revenues by $5 over here, and the CBO says, no, they decreased them by $2.9 trillion. It seems to me that it's probably not $5. Maybe it's 2.8 trillion, but it's not $5. But why did he say that? I think he said it because he has to believe it. He has to believe that tax cuts are such an enormous benefit to the economy that they'd always help. And I sat on the Budget Committee for 4 years. I listened to all sorts of economists. I listened to Republicans push them on the great virtues of tax cuts. And the economists always said, well, it depends whether they're helpful or not. Depends on a variety of other things. So, I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to say one thing about Iraq, and then I'm going to go to healthcare because that's worth spending some time on tonight. Once you're locked into a particular ideology, you become less likely to accept evidence that contradicts what you already believe. This is not a simple prevailing condition on the right. It's a human condition. Once we start to really believe something, we are convinced of it, we're going to tend to push away conflicting ideas, especially if we don't feel that we have time to dig into it the way we should. So, to me, the single most stunning fact about the invasion of Iraq and the policy making that went up to it is this. The National Security Council, the War Council for the President of the United States, for George W. Bush, never held a single meeting to discuss whether or not to invade Iraq. Not one. They had some meetings to talk about how to do it, but not one meeting to discuss whether or not to invade that country. That was the most fateful decision of the Bush administration, and they never had a meeting. And so the question is not just, I'm not trying to say, isn't that horrible? I'm trying to say, why? And I think the answer is they already knew enough. They weren't interested in the data. And for the same reason, when Donald Rumsfeld, you'll see how these concepts come together, when Donald Rumsfeld gave a speech a month before the invasion of Iraq, he explained why it was necessary to go in and get out in 3 months. Because if we don't, we will create a dependency of the Iraqis on us. We have to go in and get out because we will create a dependency. Remember, if self-reliance is a preeminent American virtue, dependency is the principal vice. And what Rumsfeld did was, first, he won the battle with Colin Powell so that Rumsfeld and the Defense Department controlled the Reconstruction period. And then they made sure there was no planning done for Reconstruction. And then Jerry Bremer, Paul Bremer, the first head of the Coalition Provisional Authority, went in and he eliminated the top layer of the bureaucracy because they'd worked for Saddam. He fired the police force and he disbanded the army. And so he put 500,000 Iraqis out of work, most of them with guns, because he wouldn't listen to people who really understood the Iraqi population and understood the consequences of those decisions. These are the actions of people who don't take the time to listen to evidence. Now, let's get to health care, because after all, Obamacare is probably the worst policy ever developed, according to people who are trying to take it down. It's socialism, it's going to do great damage. I'm going to give you some choices here. Put yourself in the place of those who are opposed to Obamacare. And I want you to pick one of the following 4 reasons for the biggest problem with this, and I'll read them 4 and then we'll do a show of hands. Obamacare, biggest problem, gives too much power to the government, gives too much power to the insurance industry, will hurt small business and reduce economic growth, will cover 25 to 30 million Americans. Got those 4 choices. So I'll go through them more slowly. Time to vote. Gives too much power to the government. How many? Okay. Gives too much power to the insurance industry. Will hurt small business and reduce economic growth. Okay. Will cover 25 to 30 million Americans. I thought I might get none for that last, but maybe I've warmed you up enough. I think that I think that those, except for will give too much power to the insurance industry. Some people who want a single-payer system might object to that, but other than that, I think there's truth in all of those. But the fact that it will cover 25 to 30 million Americans who don't have health insurance today is never mentioned as the primary reason for opposing it. But in fact, it is the classic case of creating dependency among the population. And so, if I can interrupt just a moment and turn to another selection from Mitch McConnell. He was being interviewed by Chris Wallace of Fox News. And this is just from there's a quotation here, but this is just from the book. In the 2 years after its enactment, Republicans had frequently claimed that they would repeal and replace Obamacare. How many thousand times do we hear that? After the court upheld the law, Senator Mitch McConnell was pressed 3 times by Chris Wallace on Fox News to explain how Republicans proposed to cover the 30 million Americans who would not be covered under the ACA. McConnell's response was each time, that's not the issue. Wallace, you don't think the 30 million people who are uninsured is an issue? McConnell, let me tell you what we're not going to do. We're not going to turn the American healthcare system into a Western European system. And what I say is, look at that. Think about that. You know, Tens of millions of uninsured are not the issue because the libertarian ideology has no room for their problems and no respect for Western European systems that provide near universal coverage at lower cost and with better health outcomes than our own. That's another case where it's almost as if we've forgotten what the whole purpose is. I think that healthcare politics has a lot to do with how much people in general care about other people's healthcare. And when I was in Congress, and the same would be true for Vic, we heard from thousands of people with one issue or another, people going bankruptcy, people not being able to get the care they needed, and these were, some of them were working and some were not. So I want to say just a couple of things to set this in context because of the debate going on. The origin of Obamacare, or two of the basic components of Obamacare, were put out in 1989. And they were put out by a man named Stuart Butler at the Heritage Foundation. This is a time when Democrats were more likely to be for a single-payer system, for the Canadian system, or for Medicare for all. So Stuart Butler came up with something called the Heritage Plan. And one centerpiece of the Heritage Plan was, we're not going to have the government be the single payer. We're going to have private insurance companies providing policies to individuals in exchanges regulated by the government. And the second big idea was, we're not going to have an employer mandate. We're going to have an individual mandate, because everybody should take responsibility for their own health care by paying something into the system. That was 1989, Stuart Butler, the Heritage Foundation, and that was their position. So along the way, in the interim, of course, the possibility of a single-payer system burns out politically, and this idea, which was sort of a Republican idea for a decade or so, became a Democratic idea. And the bottom line, I think, is that you couldn't have a more conservative system. One of the health policy people that I worked with in the Clinton administration said to me he could not believe that you have private insurance companies, state-regulated exchanges, and an individual mandate, and you can't get a single Republican vote. Turning quickly to climate change, I'm just going to leave that and say this is the obvious case where the science is overwhelming. Every time the international body comes out with another finding, it's the same, only in spades. And yet the denial, the millions of dollars that have been spent to sow confusion by first the oil companies and now the Koch brothers. I mean, it's just it's an incredible tragedy. But again, the denial of climate change is a necessary step for a lot of conservatives, because if they don't, in the words of the president of the Cato Institute, if they don't deny it, they'll have to do something about it. And the head of Cato said, climate change will give the government more power over the economy. Yeah, but it may save a few $1 trillion over time. So I'll wrap up with this. In Chapter 6, which I consider sort of the heart of the book, I talk a little bit about the different lenses through which people see politics and the way we interpret what's going on. And when I was in Congress, most of this was not available then, but when I was in Congress, it was George Lakoff writing about different parenting styles. But since then, there's been a book by Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Weiler about people on a scale of authoritarian and less authoritarian. And by the way, that's not meant to be a normative scale, but just different tendencies. People along that scale seem to be separating into attraction to the different political parties. And then there's a wonderful book by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics. Love the title. And he's explaining the differences, some of the differences between libertarians and conservatives and liberals in America, but that's at the end of the book. Before that, there's a real study of how our psychology evolved as a way of defending the groups that we belong to. So, and I think that there's a lot of, for those of you who are students, that's an area I think that is worth a lot of exploration going forward. There's an article by Tom Edsall in the New York Times a week ago talking about the different psychologists and sociologists and political scientists who are now focusing on this stuff, basically how we are all wired to think about politics and how that contributes to where we're going. So where are we going? I think that you could define the 20th century as a century defined by tremendous conflict among ideologies. Communism, fascism, democracy, I mean, tremendous conflict among ideologies, and millions of people died as a result of that conflict. I have hope for the 21st century. I think it's going to be the century of collaboration not just because that's what we're teaching our kids, that's what our businesses are trying to do, that's what the US military tries to do, that's what our religious communities are all about, and it's not just that. I think that this collaboration, I think the 21st century will be defined by global collaboration, particularly on economics and on the environment. When Greece catches a cold, it matters to every finance minister and every prime minister in Europe. And if it's going to affect Europe, it's going to affect the US. I mean, these small states, which used to be, could be safely ignored, cannot be ignored any longer because our economies are so interconnected. This collaboration, I think, is going to be driven by more integrated economies, vastly improved communications, and by the spread of compelling ideas and better education. And you can see that now. The one place where it's really going badly is the revival of the religious wars in the Middle East among Muslims. But I think that this broader collaboration is going to make a great difference in the world. I will say this, though. For those people who are committed individualists, and this is an uncomfortable place to be. And that's why I say when you think about the ideas that drive people who gravitate toward one party or another, the hardest work has to be done by Republicans. I am a lifelong Democrat. I have written a book which is very critical of Republican ideas. It is ultimately a pitch for a more pragmatic Republican Party, because no one party can govern this country alone. It cannot be done. As you see with the damage that can be done by, in the next few days to the U.S. economy, and then beyond that, if there is actually another crisis around the debt ceiling. So that, I think the Republican Party has to be a more pragmatic, more moderate party in order for democratic institutions that we have to function. Now, maybe that trend will be assisted by what Lindsey Graham has so vividly described as a demographic death spiral for the Republican Party, at least in presidential elections. And it is clearly having an impact. For example, in the New York Times not long ago, Bush's economic advisor, the economist, I'm blanking, he wrote an article saying, a carbon tax is worth looking at. It's what? Not Glenn Hubbard, Weil, I'll come back with it. But you can see some signs of movement there. And I think the toughest job for Republicans is to revise their conservative principles so they do not require the rejection of mainstream economics and mainstream science. And if they got there, then I think we would be able to walk back from where we are right now. All Americans, I believe, all of us, have to nurture a respect for evidence. We have to be more tolerant of ambiguity. We have to care deeply about the lives of people other than ourselves. And we have to find again a conception of the common good that is to be achieved through our governments. And I don't believe that anyone has done that better in practice than President Bill Clinton during his administration. I know that Barack Obama is speaking that language and trying to make progress, but as difficult as the Clinton years were, these seem to be a new lower level of difficulty. So I will close just, I have to say, in a nonfiction book, you can read the last sentence, and it doesn't give anything away. Because I've had some people read this and say, oh, God, I'm so depressed. And I said, you missed the point. Because I do believe, and this is partly grows out of the reflection group, I talk about how hope, faith, love, forgiveness, we need them all to keep moving when completion of our purposes eludes us. For all my alarm at the frozen state of our political discourse, I still believe that by some not yet visible process, we Americans will eventually find our way to more pragmatic public leadership inspired by a clearer commitment to the common good. I hope it happens, and I hope you help. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We have time for a couple of questions. If people would like to raise their hands to take any questions, yes, ma'am, we'll get it right here.
Did you?
Right here. Yeah. Wait. Bring the microphone to you.
How long do you think gridlock will last? How long will the shutdown be?
Oh, well, prediction, you know. You can't hold me to it, but you know, I do have some thoughts. I think the shutdown will be fairly short. I think it will be fairly short. I think they will walk back somehow. Boehner, sooner or later, has to pass a bill with Democratic support. He has to. He knows that as we are sitting here. He knows that. And so I think he will do it sooner rather than later, because the longer it goes on, the more he will be seen to be forced to do it, and the more unpleasant it will be. So I expect a shutdown of some duration. And then my guess is maybe tonight he's saying, look, you know, the only thing we're going to have to do, at some point he's going to say to them, we have to bring a bill to the floor that Democrats can vote for. And so some of you can preserve your independence and not go along with it. And that would be a very ugly meeting. I've been in a few ugly caucus meetings, and that would be an ugly one, I'm sure.
Okay, Nate, right here. No, right here.
Hi, Nate Kennedy, Clinton School from Missouri. You say you want more of these thoughtful, moderate people that like ambiguity, like to get into the details. But the structures that we elect Congress by, like redistricting, they don't really allow for moderates to be elected. You said it wasn't a main cause, but what are some things we can do to make sure that structure can allow for more moderate members of Congress to be elected?
Yeah. Great question. I'll give you a couple. In Maine and in California now and some other states, the legislature doesn't have sole control over redistricting. You get suggestions submitted to a so-called independent commission, and then the independent commission risks becoming political, with some sort of judicial oversight. And when you do that, it's better, let's say. There's not as much a chance to do what Tom DeLay did in Texas, where they could draw a line, and they probably still can probably in place. You can draw a line street by street, so you choose which voters are in which districts. And it's just, you know, that's not the way it's supposed to work. So I think that would happen. I think that having more congressional districts in play is important. I also think that Mickey Edwards is right by saying if you had more open primaries and independents could come and vote in those primaries, I know this is anathema to both parties in most cases, but I do think it would help. I mean, the people in the middle, problem is a lot of them don't pay as much attention, but on the other hand, they are some sort of leavening, mitigating force, and you ought to be trying to get them back into the system.
Questions? Right here in the front row. She's bringing the microphone to you.
We're here from Maine to study the, the Mayflower oil spill, and I wonder how you would envision reconciling the need for energy self-sufficiency with the global warming effects and the catastrophic environmental effect.
Yeah. Well, it was a big issue for me when I was in Congress, and it still is. I mean, there's so much work to do. Hard to do it when most people in one party just deny the science. And, you know, you can see in Texas, there's a story today that, you know, you've got climate deniers and evolution deniers on the state board that's picking biology textbooks. But to me, I always felt that if you could do, and this is an area where Obama, I think, is moving, you basically have to do something about coal. You just have to. And we have been given an amazing gift of finding much more natural gas in the U.S. than we had before. And that's, although it's a fossil fuel, it's a bit of a bridge that will help on the path to greener technologies. But I think that the regulation of old coal plants is where we make the biggest difference. And that's if we can basically clean them up or not incentivize their continuation, it reduces mercury pollution tremendously as well. But the bottom line is startup industries that are going to be good in the long run need to be supported. And there's, you know, a lot of Republicans will not give up the oil depletion allowance and other benefits for the existing oil companies, which are big enough and strong enough to get by on their own. They won't give up those, but they also won't provide, you know, assistance to solar and wind power. I've got an old farm in Sebago, Maine, that is solely run on solar power. And, you know, there's so much we can do. And there's so many places in the world where solar power is going to be, you know, a real benefit. It's a tragedy that we didn't do more as a country to incentivize the manufacture of those kinds of chips and panels. The East Germans did, and then the Chinese did. And, you know, all that furor about Solyndra, a lot of which got money from the federal government, a lot of the problems, most of the problems for Solyndra, as I understand it, is the Chinese were developing new technologies so fast that what they were doing became uncompetitive. And I mean, you have to do as much as you can to make the transition as fast as possible, because we've got big issues. Fortunately, I think the new Chinese leadership gets this. How much they will do is a question, but I think it's pretty clear that the new Chinese leadership understands this in a way that the old leadership didn't.
Question, yes. Romero's right here. He's right behind you, yeah.
Ramirez Beto from Magnolia, Class 9, Clinton School student. My question to you, sir, is how can Democrats develop a message to get people that used to vote Democrat but now vote Republican to return back to the Democratic Party? And how can a pragmatist come up with a plan to defeat an ideologue? I'm
sorry, how can a pragmatist compete with an ideologue?
How can a pragmatist defeat an ideologue?
Well, it depends on your constituency. You know, it's hard. There are lots of things in life that can't be done. I mean, I ran for governor and lost. I ran for Congress 6 times and won. Then I ran against Susan Collins in Maine for the Senate and lost. And there are just some things you can't do. But that doesn't mean you can't try, and it doesn't mean you can't try to figure it out in particular circumstances. I think that a lot of it comes down for Democrats. For Democrats, it comes down to practice what you preach. You have to work in communities with people, talking with them, and do everything you can. Now, you are part of a generation, students over here, you are part of a generation that is going to transform this country, I believe. Because if you look at the split in vote for Romney and for Obama as a measure, this is the most liberal generation there is, and people in ours, Vic's and mine, well, we're not. Ours, the over 65s are the only ones who voted for Romney over Obama. And a lot of this has to do with just how well people adapt to change. And I think in trying to build any sort of movement, any sort of community, you have to have respect for the fact that not everyone's going to come along at the same way or at all, and you work with the people you can work with, you do what you can. Teddy Roosevelt said once that the way to approach life is do what you can with what you have, where you are.
And with that, let me say that I know there are a lot of questions, but I want you to, because we've got to have some time for him to sign the book. But just remember, on the night before the government shut down, you have the opportunity to purchase Dangerous Convictions. Let's give a round of applause to Congressman Allen.
Thank you. Thank you.